if at any point you can't hear me, raise your hand. How does that work? As Kimberly said, my name is Connie Chamberlain, and I do want to welcome everybody here today. I see a number of people who I know care very deeply about this issue. I am President and CEO of Housing Opportunities Made Equal, a position I have held for more than 20 years. And I'd like to share a couple of other numbers with you as well. It is 20 years since the protection of the Fair Housing Act was extended to families with children and people with disabilities. This year also marks the 40th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, which is the nation's first comprehensive fair housing law and which protects people from discrimination in housing on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, and gender. It is 140 years since discrimination on the basis of race was made illegal in 1868. You would think that we had enough time to get this right. But as you will see from the results of our testing that we're going to talk about today, apparently not. Okay, now I have to figure out how to work this thing. All right, Housing Opportunities Made Equal. We've been around since 1971, and this organization is an organization that is dedicated to ensuring equal access to housing for all people, something that's guaranteed under the laws of the United States and of Virginia. HOME has been working to achieve this goal for almost 40 years. We are a private, nonprofit fair housing organization with offices in Richmond and Portsmouth, and we promote access to housing in a variety of ways. Our Center for Housing Education helps individuals overcome their personal barriers to housing through counseling, education, financial literacy training. We have one of the preeminent foreclosure intervention and prevention programs in the Commonwealth, in which our trained counselors work with borrowers and lenders to help create performing loans that work for the lender and keep the borrower in their home. Helping one person at a time is important, and it has made huge differences in the lives of many people. But it's ultimately not going to change the social and economic systems that continue to create barriers to housing and to equal access. HOME's Center for Housing Leadership promotes policy solutions to those barriers, such as the establishment of a housing trust fund, protections for consumers in the mortgage market, or ensuring equal treatment for qualified tenants regardless of source of income. And our Center for Housing Advocacy investigates fair housing violations, helps to enforce the law, and educates consumers, the housing industry, local governments, and the community about fair housing and how they can all help to ensure equal access to housing. We've been successfully formulating and carrying out programs to prevent and eliminate discriminatory housing practices since 1971. One of the ways we do this is that every so often we conduct what's called a fair housing audit, a series of fair housing tests that create a snapshot of market conditions, a picture of the kinds of treatment people encounter in their search for a place to live. We have recently completed such an audit in the Hampton Roads area, in all 7 localities, in which we investigated what kinds of experiences African Americans, people with disabilities, families with children, and holders of housing choice vouchers would have as they looked for housing. The methodology that we used, fair housing testing, is the same methodology that is used by HUD, the Department of Justice, and the Virginia Fair Housing Office, among others, and all of those agencies have contracted with HOME to conduct testing for them. HOME's own use of testing has been ratified by the United States Supreme Court, which voted unanimously to give HOME and its testers standing to bring fair housing lawsuits. Housing discrimination still occurs in dramatic, obvious ways, but it also more commonly occurs through untruths, incomplete information, and subtle discouragement. People who experience housing discrimination may have been given misleading or inaccurate information about the availability or cost of housing, and they may never know that they've been treated unlawfully because they have no way of comparing their treatment to the treatment of anyone else. Frequently, the only way to uncover that form of discrimination is through testing. And testing is something, in addition to the agencies that I mentioned, that has been conducted throughout the United States. I've got a quote here from the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation recommending testing as one of the only ways to determine whether or not lending discrimination is occurring. Fair housing testing is a controlled investigative procedure in which individuals inquire about a housing unit and collect information about their experience. It's a way of getting information excuse me, about actual practices in the housing market and allows comparison of the treatment experienced, confirms the existence or application of various policies, and helps to determine whether or not illegal discrimination has occurred. Highly trained volunteers pose as bona fide home seekers. One of the techniques that we used as part of this audit was matched pair testing. In matched pair testing, the testers use profiles in which they are qualified for the housing, and in the case of matched pair testing, request the same type of housing for the same dates. If one is testing for rates, that will be the only difference between the pair of testers. Since they are similarly qualified, want the same kind of housing for the same time, they should be given similar information. If they are not, the only explanation is the one factor that is different. In this case, race. All in all, we completed 165 tests from the fall of 2007 through mid-2008. 50 paired tests assessed differences in treatment in the rental market based on race. 50 single contact tests determined the willingness of landlords to make required reasonable, is this better? That's worse. Required reasonable modifications or accommodations for people with disabilities. 25 on-site tests of new multifamily housing evaluated compliance with the accessibility requirements. 20 single contact tests evaluated the experience of families with children, and 20 single contact tests determined the willingness of housing providers to accept housing choice vouchers. And I should mention that the fair housing laws do not protect holders of housing choice vouchers. We conducted these tests because of the critical need for affordable housing. We thought knowing whether or not housing choice vouchers were having difficulty finding a place to live would be a critical element and very useful in terms of public policy. We conducted tests in all 7 Hampton Roads localities. Differential treatment based on race. To find out whether African Americans were being treated fairly, we compared the experience of an African American home seeker with that of a white. Both testers, as I said earlier, were seeking the same kind of housing during the same time frame, and they had similar income, credit, and family composition. Profiles were adjusted to fit the unique characteristics of the test subject, such as the rent range, or the location in which the test was being conducted, such as the closeness of employment opportunities. Testers were generally salaried, always with an income sufficient to qualify for the unit, and the African American tester was always slightly better qualified than the white in terms of credit and income. Both testers in a pair were instructed to ask for similar types of units, such as apartments, number of bedrooms, whatever it is the housing provider had available, rent ranges, and availability dates. Census data was used to identify census tracts or block groups that were more than 50% whites, since those are the areas in which blacks have historically experienced difficulty in finding housing. Within those census tracts, available housing was identified through a variety of sources, including classified ads, ads on the internet, yard signs, and apartment guides. Most of the test sites were apartment complexes, although some single-family homes and units in smaller buildings were tested. Of the 50 matched pair tests that we conducted for race, 66% of the time, the white tester was favored. 6% of the time, the black tester was favored, and in 28% of the time, there was similar treatment. The results should have been that 100% of the time, there was similar treatment. But in fact, 2/3 of the time, blacks were treated less favorably than whites, limiting their housing choices. And I'm going to give you some examples of how this actually played out. And you will see in many of these cases that if you didn't have the comparison, you would not be able to tell that you had been discriminated against. These are all test results from the recent audit within the past year. The black tester was told that rents were between $1,049 and $1,104. The white tester was told to ignore the prices in the brochure and given prices that were about $100 less per month. The black tester was told that one unit was available, and when they asked to see it, was told that it couldn't be shown. The white tester was told that several units were available and was given a key to view the units. The black tester was told that nothing was available. The white tester was told that 2 units were available. The black tester was told that 1 unit would be available for a $132 application fee and 1 month's rent, $929 as the security deposit. The white tester was told of more units, that the application fee was only $32, $100 less, and that the security deposit was $250, roughly 1/4 of the security deposit demanded of the black. In another case, the black tester was told that no 1-bedroom apartments were available and that they would have to submit an application to be placed on the waiting list. The white tester was also told that no 1-bedroom apartments were available, but for them, there was no trouble at all getting on the waiting list. In another case, the black tester was told that nothing was available and not to bother getting on the waiting list because people never moved out. The white tester was told and shown several units that were available. And I need to emphasize that these visits were made within a very short time of each other. So it's not a question of one tester going in and then things changing by the time the next tester came in. That's really pretty appalling. These are the kinds of things that you might have expected to see 50 years ago, but that we certainly should not be seeing today. The other kind of testing that we did is what I referred to earlier as single contact testing. It's used when one person can gather the necessary information and you don't need paired testers. And it's based on the stated policies and procedures of the housing provider, or in the case of the accessibility requirements, on straightforward observation. In 1988, 20 years ago, the law was amended to require covered multifamily housing to be designed and constructed to be physically accessible to people with disabilities. This housing must incorporate 7 basic design elements. Building entrance wide enough so that somebody can get in with a wheelchair, and obviously accessible without steps, the ultimate barrier to somebody in a wheelchair. This includes accessible public use and common areas. If you have a disability and you're paying for an apartment, you should have the full use and enjoyment of all the amenities the apartment has to offer, including common areas. Doors wide enough for a wheelchair. An accessible route to and through the unit. You ought to be able to get to all parts of your unit, and you ought to be able to live in them comfortably. Accessible light switches and environmental controls. If you can't turn the heat up and down, you can't get the lights on, you can't reach the outlets, then it's going to be pretty hard for you living in that unit. Reinforcements in bathroom walls to allow later installation of grab bars. and kitchens and bathrooms with space for a wheelchair user to maneuver. And I've heard some people say, well, but we only need to have a certain percentage of our units accessible. That's not true. When we are talking about multifamily housing, unless there is something very, very strange about the site, and it's very hilly, for example, all units on the first floor are required to meet these accessibility guidelines. And if the building has an elevator, all units are required to meet these accessibility guidelines. That's been true for 20 years. And think about this. You know, maybe some of you know somebody in a wheelchair, or maybe at some point you'll have an elderly parent living with you who uses a wheelchair. Or as people in the disability community tend to say, you know, you're just temporarily able-bodied. Anybody could need accessible housing. And a rough estimate of the number of people in wheelchairs in Hampton Roads is something like 6,000. This law was passed to meet a huge need for accessible, affordable housing. We visited 25 covered multifamily housing sites in Hampton Roads that were built within the past 2 years. Only 3 were fully compliant. 88% had at least one area of non-compliance, and many of these would make it simply impossible for someone in a wheelchair to use and enjoy the unit. 72% had 3 or more areas of non-compliance. 36% had 4 or more areas of non-compliance. So it is a huge problem. And here are the kinds of non-compliance that we found. Again, this is a law that was passed 20 years ago, and there's been lots and lots of education and training on this. Steps, changes in levels, for example, the patio drops off 4 inches. Well, if you're in a wheelchair, you might conceivably be able to get onto the patio, but you're sure not going to get back. A step leading into the unit, a step leading into the building cannot be managed if you are in a wheelchair. 64% had non-compliant elements in common areas, like mailboxes and trash facilities. Well, if you can't dump your trash, what are you going to do? If you can't get your mail, what are you going to do? You're paying for this. Someone with a disability is paying the same price that somebody without a disability is paying. 52% had non-compliant bathrooms, bathrooms in which there wasn't room for a person in the wheelchair to use the facilities, close the door, and meet the guidelines. 48% had a lack of accessible designated parking. 40% had environmental controls where it would be difficult for somebody in a wheelchair to reach them, and 20% had non-compliant kitchens. The law also requires, and again this has been true for 20 years, that housing providers allow someone with a disability to make reasonable modifications, physical modifications, to the unit if necessary, such as the installation of ramps or switching doorknobs to levers, for example. We conducted 25 tests to see whether or not housing providers would permit a simple modification, the installation of grab bars in the bathroom. 80% agreed. 1 rejected the request outright. And 4 discouraged the prospective tenant by saying things that were simply not true. Well, you can install the grab bars, but then you'll have to take them out later. That is not a requirement of the law. And these kinds of things can make the difference in whether or not somebody is able to use and move about the unit. The law also requires that housing providers make reasonable accommodations in their policies and procedures if necessary for someone with a disability to have full enjoyment of the unit. The most common request is for a service animal, such as a seeing eye dog. The animal is not a pet, but an auxiliary aid, like a walker. Housing providers are required to allow the animal, regardless of whether or not they have a no pets policy, and may not charge extra. So our testers asked whether the landlord would permit them to have a service animal. "76% either rejected the animal outright, discouraged the tester, or imposed illegal fees. 24% were willing to permit the animal. People have service animals because they need them. It's not a whim. Whether it's a seeing eye dog or a dog that alerts for seizures or a cat that is the basis of emotional security for a severely disturbed person, these animals are not pets and they are not to be considered pets. And there has been training and education on this issue for 20 years. So it is very, very discouraging to find that 76% of the time the request for a service animal is being rejected. We also conducted tests to find out whether families with children would be given access to housing in a non-discriminatory manner. Housing providers may not discriminate against families with children, and that includes not making decisions for families about which apartments are appropriate for them, or whether the complex at all is the right complex, or how many bedrooms they need to have if the family wants a reasonable occupancy standard, which is generally considered to be 2 persons per bedroom. It's not the place of the housing provider to say, well, I think you need 3 bedrooms because I don't want your kids sleeping together. They don't get to do that. Three of the tested housing providers discouraged families with children. They said things like, we don't have any first floor units available. Well, they don't get to choose. If they've got second floor units, then they need to make those available to the families with children. Or this isn't a good place for children. 17, 85% got it right. And we are very grateful for that, because in the midst of a lot of the bad news, that's a lot of progress. We also tested to determine whether or not housing choice vouchers would be accepted. There is no legal requirement to accept a voucher, but the whole purpose of the voucher program was to give low and moderate income families housing choices and not tie them to particular neighborhoods, which might not be the best neighborhoods for them and which would contribute to the concentration of poverty, something that most localities are working very hard to change. That program is not working. So few housing providers accept housing choice vouchers that voucher holders have extremely limited housing choices, resulting in concentrations of voucher holders rather than the opportunities the program was intended to provide. "85% of the housing providers either rejected the voucher holder outright or discouraged them in ways that made it impossible or very unattractive for them to use the unit. One said, I'll take the voucher, but you still have to meet the income requirements of 4 times the rent. Well, if I could meet the income requirements of 4 times the rent, I wouldn't need the voucher. Now, some of you may be wondering, America is facing one of the biggest financial crises in its history. The financial markets have collapsed, taking with them the hopes and dreams of millions of hardworking Americans. Why are we bothering to talk about housing discrimination, an issue that some people think is relatively unimportant? Well, let's go back and talk about race. First of all, if you are the person being discriminated against, it's not unimportant at all. It is a big deal. It not only deprives you of the ability to choose where your family lives and the schools your children are going to attend, but strikes at the heart of your ability to take care of your family and your feeling of self-worth. The impact of housing discrimination on individuals and families have been well documented, and they range from everything from decreased wealth building capacity to poor health. But the community should care as well. Let me relate the current financial crisis to a little history. This is going to be a fast trip, but it may give you a few things to think about. In the 1920s and 1930s, banks, insurance companies, and the federal government began formally redlining African American neighborhoods. Essentially, as a result of these institutionalized and racist practices, minority neighborhoods did not have access to credit. One result was the disinvested neighborhoods that localities are spending billions of dollars to revitalize. Another result was that these communities were starved for credit. They couldn't get mainstream credit, so this being America, creative entrepreneurs began developing new products, starting about 15 years ago when something called the subprime mortgage was invented. These loans were loans that in theory charged higher prices because the homeowner represented a higher risk. And the lenders targeted the minority community with high-cost loans, whether or not the people there actually represented a greater risk. And studies of subprime high-cost loans generally, one which was done by the Wall Street Journal within the past year, have indicated that in fact at least half the people in high-cost loans qualified for prime loans. Many of the people in these communities could have qualified for prime loans. They didn't know it. And after decades of difficulty getting credit, even these loans looked pretty good. As you know, this is where the collapse in the housing market began, as people with subprime mortgages, initially concentrated in low-income and minority communities, began to fall behind on their payments. Now, anytime you try to collapse about 90 years of history into 2 or 3 paragraphs, you're going to leave out a couple details. But I think that the broad outline is very clear. This is a fair housing issue, and it happened because regulators were unwilling to force lenders to address the legitimate need for credit in minority communities. We have seen the results. It is a dramatic example of what happens when the fair housing laws are not enforced. Housing discrimination is not an issue that affects just other people. It affects all of us, the entire community. We have had decades of education and training for the housing industry. Programs have been offered in Hampton Roads by the Virginia Fair Housing Office, professional housing industry associations, local governments, the Hampton Roads Community Housing Resources Board, and others. Licensing requirements for the Virginia Real Estate Board mandate continuing education in fair housing. The Fair Housing Board administers a voluntary fair housing certification program. Educational programs on meeting the accessibility requirements have been offered on a regular basis for architects, builders, and developers. In 2002, there was extensive coverage of an earlier home audit that showed similar levels of race discrimination and lack of compliance with the accessibility guidelines. Despite all these efforts, it's clearly not working. In fact, the amount of differential treatment on the basis of race has actually gone up. What next? Because we really don't want to have another press conference in another 6 years and have the same results. Education is clearly not enough, but it is essential. The Fair Housing Certification Program should be mandatory. It should be mandatory for housing providers and everyone working in the property management industry, and there should be penalties for those who are not certified. We need to bring compliance with the accessibility standards into the permitting process for all multifamily housing construction, starting with giving those standards a prominent place on local government websites and handing them out to everybody who comes in requesting a permit. We also need aggressive enforcement of the fair housing law that clearly demonstrates that housing discrimination is not acceptable in the Commonwealth of Virginia. While there are obviously many good housing providers who do not discriminate, there are others who will only change their practices if they are held to account and if the cost of violating these laws is high. I am going to be happy to answer any questions, but before I do, I'd like to turn the podium over to Sylvia Berry with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which has provided some funding to help us get the words about these audit results out. Sylvia, where are you?
Thank you, Connie. On behalf of Secretary Preston, the Secretary of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity Assistant Secretary Kim Kendrick, Wanda Nieves, the Region 3 Director, John Bravacos, Region 3 Director as well, and also Ruth Winston, who is the Director of the Richmond Office of Fair Housing. We greet you. We are delighted and it's our pleasure, as always, to work with Housing Opportunities Made Equal in Virginia and also with the Virginia Office of Fair Housing. We're delighted to find the results, and we would like for everyone to know that this just shows that we have to continue to be diligent in our efforts in affirmatively furthering fair housing in our communities. Again, we would like to say thank you. We greet you on behalf of the department, and we're also delighted that everyone showed up today because this is a very, very important matter. Thank you.
If anybody has any questions, I will be happy to answer them. If I can't answer them, I'm going to refer them to HOME's Director of Fair Housing, Education, and Enforcement, Susan Scoville. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah,
yes.
The findings of your study clearly are alarming and disturbing. I'm wondering what, if any, legal action has been taken on this, because if the findings are accurate, surely it is a violation of the law, and I'm curious if you've begun any legal action against any particular housing developments that may engage in this unfair practice.
We are evaluating the results of all of these tests on a case-by-case basis. We are working with the Virginia Fair Housing Office, with the Department of Housing and Community Development, which has responsibility for state building code enforcement, and with the localities. So I think you can assume that those people for whom follow-up action is necessary, it will be taken.
If I may follow up quickly, I'm wondering if you can identify any of the housing areas that are of particular concern to you, or that where you made these findings, because I think everyone would like to know that.
Well, you know, everybody always really does want to know that, and everybody also always wants to know exactly who did it. We are not releasing the information on the individual housing providers at this point, because we frankly do not want to distract from the larger message, which is that the entire region has a problem. We have learned from experience that if we say, well, this is where we had the problem and this is where we had the problem, that's what gets focused on, and it makes everybody else feel like they're off the hook.
One more follow-up, if I may. Don't you think identifying them, though, puts them on the spot to enact change?
Well, for those that need their act changed, they will be identified further on in appropriate ways.
I know it doesn't look good, but have they improved from the time before? Have they gotten worse than before? What did you notice?
The findings on the basis of race, and the last time around we just did race and accessibility testing. And the findings on the basis of race have actually gotten worse. Last time it was 62%, this time it was 66%. The findings for accessibility got a little better. It was 96% of the buildings were non-compliant in 2002 and 88% today. And I believe in your packets you have a copy of the 2002 study as well as the current study. Yes, ma'am.
I have kind of been involved with county for a number of years. Like I was a social worker in the housing projects here for a while, there was independent work in Hampton and ran halfway houses. And I now run a little program
Well, I think you make some very good points, and thank you for reminding me of a couple of things that I didn't mention. First of all, of course, the Housing Choice Voucher Program is available to poor whites as well as poor blacks. And if somebody won't accept a voucher, it's going to have an impact on everyone. The other point that I should have emphasized is that the units that we tested covered a wide range of costs, from $575 a month to almost $2,800 a month. So the problem that we are talking about is not a problem that is limited to or even focused on low-income folks. It is much broader than that. Yes, sir.
Did you say that the last time it was 62%?
Yes.
The paperwork says 60%.
60. Thank you. It's been a while since I've looked at that. Thank you for correcting me. It's gotten worse. Yes, sir.
Can you speak to the role and responsibility of organizations that are recipients of federal funds, CDBG funds, home funds, and their role and responsibility in enforcing fair housing?
Well, I think that everybody has a role and responsibility in enforcing fair housing, and I think when you're talking about recipients of federal funds, that's an even greater responsibility. These are taxpayer dollars, and those taxpayer dollars are coming from all different kinds of people, and they have a right to know that their money is being spent in a non-discriminatory fashion. I think in dealing with the accessibility guidelines, Home believes that there should be no taxpayer dollars spent on housing that is not, to the greatest extent possible, accessible to people with disabilities. And we would advocate for that. For example, community development corporations that are working in the field, we don't expect everyone to become expert in fair housing, but we think educating yourselves, your clients, your customers, and providing them access to fair housing investigation services, for example, is really, really important. You had a question, I think?
Yeah, I had actually two questions. You know, the one thing your group is promoting is fair housing laws to be aggressively enforced. But as you said, oftentimes these situations are rather subtle. They only come out with this fair testing. So how do you suggest anyone go about enforcing these laws?
Okay, well, let's start with the ones that you can recognize, because let's say you're a person with a disability and you need to have a service animal. You're blind, you have a seeing eye dog. If you get rejected for that seeing eye dog, you need to file a complaint. We are hoping that one of the results of the publicity from this audit will be that people will be encouraged to seek fair housing help and fair housing enforcement actions where it's appropriate. When you're talking about someone who doesn't have a way to compare his or her treatment with that of somebody else, you know, lots of times people have hunches. They just feel that something is wrong. They're not sure what it is, and they don't really know what to do about it. Those people need to come to an organization like Home and say, I have a funny feeling about this. And we test in response to individual complaints. And we will let them know what the results of our testing is. You know, I also think, frankly, that this kind of testing, this kind of audit or systemic testing for problems in a particular industry or a particular type of housing ought to be done on a regular basis. Because that's ultimately the only way we're going to uncover all of it.
Can you speak at all as to how many individual complaints your organization received last year?
Not nearly as many as the level of discrimination would lead you to believe. Susan, can you have that off?
Not very many.
Yeah.
Not very many in the state fair housing office doesn't get that many.
And I think that speaks to exactly what you were saying. It's very difficult for people to tell when it's actually happening. Yes?
Do you know what the timetable is when any lawsuits might be filed?
Can't really tell you that because it's working with a whole lot of different people and a lot of different agencies, and You know, obviously, we're going to deal with this as quickly as we can, but I can't really give you an estimate. Somebody in back? Yes.
Talking about the accessibility and looking at your chart here, it seems like so many of the housing complexes didn't meet the guidelines and have major deficiencies. Is there not something within the regulations of those who provide the certificates of occupancy to prevent them from opening?
That's a really good question. We have met with every locality in Hampton Roads over the past couple of weeks, and we have talked with them about the role of the building officials, and I think in every case they were very concerned and wanting to figure out how they could improve compliance with these guidelines. We have every hope that as a result of this and as a result of the discussions that will go forward, that things will get better.
Legally, these buildings that were built within the last 20 years, they should not have been allowed to open if they didn't meet the guidelines.
That's correct. Or the guidelines, I mean, they should have been corrected early on. Now, some of these things can be relatively easily corrected. Some of them are going to be very expensive to correct. You know, we are also, as I think I mentioned earlier, we're talking with the Department of Housing and Community Development, which runs the building code enforcement program that provides training for local building officials. And they are going to be evaluating this, trying to figure out at what points in the process things broke down. And, you know, on the one hand, the building official should catch these things. On the other hand, we can't lose sight of the fact that it's the responsibility of the builder and the developer and the owner to get this right. And you can have a building official inspecting something and it looks okay, and the next day somebody comes in and does something different. So, you know, I don't think we can point the finger just at the building officials. Everybody's got a responsibility here. Other questions? Yes?
What would you suggest in terms of the housing voucher program to turn that around? I mean, you basically declared that program a failure in terms of dispersing a certain population and providing them access to fair housing. So,
Couple of things. When you talk to housing providers about why they don't accept housing choice vouchers, there are generally two answers. One is they're not really sure about the quality of the tenants, and the other is they don't like working with the bureaucracy that administers the housing choice voucher program. We know those things can be solved. We know that because we have in the past run a mobility program for housing choice voucher holders, that the tenants holding housing choice vouchers can be easily as good or better than people who do not use vouchers. And we also know that there are housing authorities that run well-administered programs for housing choice vouchers. And when we ran the mobility program, we overcame the disadvantages to the housing providers because the situation has to work for both. There are states, for example, Utah, a particularly conservative state, where source of income is a protected class. And that means that as long as you qualify for the unit, and I have to emphasize this, you know, you have to be a good tenant, and you have to have good references if you check for references. As long as you qualify for the unit, you can't discriminate on the basis of the source of income. Frankly, housing choice vouchers in many ways are a more reliable source of income than jobs in a period of recession, for example. So we would support legislation that includes source of income as a protected class. Anybody else? Okay, thank you all so much for coming.